So I've entitled the talk, Europe's Extending Electricity Grid from Shetland to Cyprus, Israel and Egypt, and how it benefits Orkney. So first of all, I've just got a little drawing here that shows Europe's current grids. So there are 5 large synchronous AC grids. There's a mistake on the map in that Iceland isn't part of one, but it's shown as being as part of the Nordic grid. But the rest are covering the EU, and they're interconnected by DC cables. So all these that have got colours on, there are interconnections. There are also interconnections to other countries like Morocco, Turkey, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. These are smaller connections. Yeah, that's that screen. Right, move on to the next one. So what I've got here is a drawing showing the interconnected circuits that are part of the European grid. Europe has got a target of a 15% of the maximum demand in each country to be met by interconnection with adjacent countries. So this is kind of politically driven in that they want to say that they've got an open market across the whole of Europe. But there are good technical reasons why you need at least 15%, and in some places it will be substantially more, and there will be benefits from having more in certain cases. But as you can see on this, hopefully you can see my mouse moving, there's one EU country at the moment, which is Cyprus down here, which isn't connected to this at the moment. It's still an island grid. So there's work ongoing to make a connection from the European grids to Cyprus and then onwards to Israel and Egypt as well. This first section here, which is linking the mainland of Greece to the island of Crete, is to be connected this year, and then by 2024 another link is going to go to Cyprus, and 2 smaller links, one from Cyprus to Israel and one from Cyprus to Egypt. So that's the extension of the grid in a south and easterly direction. So there's also a proposal for a Great Britain to Morocco grid connection by 2030. This is by a firm called X-Links, and it will be 2 by 1.8 gigawatt circuits, so they can get 3.6 gigawatts out of it. This will be the equivalent of a nuclear power station that's being built at Hinkley Point. In Morocco there will be a mix of wind and PV, plus large-scale battery storage. 20 gigawatt hours with 5 gigawatts of capacity for the battery storage. And they're estimating a price of 4.8 pence per kilowatt hour of electricity delivered to the UK. And the cables are going to be 3,800 kilometres in length each. And that 2 circuits will be 4 cables. There's also a potential for a link to Iceland. It's been talked about for many years, and it's the same sort of potential as Norway has at the moment, in that Norway has lots of hydro power stations, which if they don't need the power, if we export power to them, they can shut the hydro power stations down, and if we need more power because we haven't got enough generation of our own, they can use the hydropower stations to export power to us. It benefits both countries in that they're making money for providing storage for us, and we are having storage at less cost than building it ourselves. You would have to go to the English Midlands, somewhere around about here, to make a connection to Iceland now, because from there north we're already filling up with, I've jumped on a slide, sorry. We're already filling up the networks with our wind power from Scotland. And if you look from here to Iceland, it's probably further than from here to Norway or here to Denmark. it might be better to come from Iceland to link into the European grid in Ireland, somewhere about this area. So we've got projects being built, we've got projects that are planned and where routes are being actively sought, and we've got potential projects. And this can give us an increase in the scope for diversity. I've got the small red circle is what we've got now, and the larger red circle is what we could be getting in the future. This gives us a larger area for wind power variation as the wind changes in various places, and also across different time zones for solar power. So this is a graph, a drawing rather. It shows that Egypt here gets the sunshine about 2.5 hours sooner than Morocco here. So we get a longer period of export of solar directly to Europe because of the geographical diversity. In Morocco and Egypt, the day length doesn't change in half as much as it does in Orkney. So you're not quite exactly 12 hours a day, but you're fairly close throughout the whole year. Right. So this little graph, Morocco is 2.5 hours behind Egypt. Egypt's... Sorry, somebody's saying something? No.
I think it's Susan's mic is not muted.
So it's a bit difficult to see, but Egypt is this grey line, and this blue line is Morocco. So this is just two curves. The curves are picked actually are the existing curves for about the 21st of March, which is the equinox, spring equinox in the UK. And you can see that the curves, when you add them, add twice that amount of energy together, are different depending on whether you get them mixed, one from Egypt and one from Morocco, which is the yellow line, and then this sort of brown line is if you left it all in Morocco and didn't have a link into Egypt. So the interconnectors aren't there for this. This is just to show the principle that geographic locations can allow you to have a more even output. In the 2.5 hours earlier, we get 10% more energy at below 5 gigawatts. That's just a random number that I picked, a round number there, that line. And, oops, we got 10% more energy below that figure. And if we had to store anything that was above that to use later, we'd save 5.1 gigawatt hours of storage. But if we were to go to India, which is not proposed at the moment, but potentially could be in the future, we've got 6.5 hours time difference. That gives us 50.8% more energy below 5 gigawatts input, and we're saving 24.7 gigawatt hours of storage. And that's a significant saving. Now, I'll get further on in the presentation and I'll be talking about the relative costs. So that's looking at solar. But we actually have more wind than we have PV in the UK and in much of Europe as well. So I went to look just how wind power varies across different parts of Europe. And I've got one country here that was really high figures. This is a percentage of its installed capacity on a particular day. And we've got the UK down at the bottom. So this was actually yesterday morning at 9 o'clock. We were very, very low. 3 o'clock in the afternoon we were also low. 9 o'clock at night we picked up a bit. 3 o'clock this morning we picked up a bit more. And we shot up to about 30% by 9 o'clock this morning. There are different countries marked, and the brown line is the average of the percentage outputs. Now, if you've got more in your country, you're going to skew it in your direction, but this is just to show the potential for geographic diversity. And this is the countries that I used. Got GB, Ireland, Spain, Poland, not Poland, Finland, Lithuania, Romania, and this one that we're just talking about connecting down in the bottom right hand side, which is Cyprus. And if I just go back, Cyprus, which is this green line here, by the time it came to 9 o'clock this morning, that was the lowest output in the areas that I looked at. So potentially in the future, if we'd got excess energy, we could be transmitting it all the way across Europe, and Cyprus could be making up by importing power that ultimately was sourced from Orkney even. So how does all this benefit Orkney? Well, our electricity prices depend on the trading price in the Great Britain grid. And this is currently quite high due to the high cost of gas use to produce some of our electricity. In March, about 40% of the electricity produced in the UK came from gas-fired power stations, and 20% coming from wind power. We also got 6.58% coming from imports, of which 3.13% came from Norwegian hydroelectric power stations. So the grid connection to Norway that was connected last year is making a significant contribution to our energy, electrical energy, last month rather I should say, and that contribution is helping reduce the cost, keeping our prices low. We also exported energy, and 2.21% of our energy available was exported, but almost 3/4 of that went to France. And that's because France in March, which is the month I picked, had a particular problem with some nuclear power stations going off, and they were having to import a lot of power. So customers benefit when importing because the imports are at a cheaper price than generating the electricity in GB would cost. So in other words, we're not burning gas, we're importing it. If we were burning gas, we would increase the price of gas because there's a limited finite supply. So we're benefiting from reduced electricity prices, but we're also benefiting from holding the gas prices down. I know it doesn't affect folks in Orkney directly, but it will in other parts of the country. And producers benefit when exporting as they get a higher price than they could sell electricity for in GB. While exports can push up the price of electricity in GB, they do ensure that generators can achieve acceptable returns on their investments, which is important if we are to increase the total amount of renewables in GB and in Orkney. So trading with Europe's enabling more renewable generation in Orkney. It brings on follow-on economic benefits in terms of employment, community benefit, and potentially cheaper electricity. However, this is possibly the controversial bit, we shouldn't expect an island's electricity tariff just because we have generation in Orkney. For many years, in fact really right back to 1943, politicians have fought to have a common tariff across the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board area, which is now operated by the northern part of SSEN. At any point, a cost-reflective tariff would have increased prices in Orkney. So we've had politicians arguing for many, many years for a common tariff, and that has benefited Orkney significantly, and all the other island groups, and the remote parts of the Highlands where they've had to run 10 miles of line. So I want to reinforce that At any point, a cost-reflective tariff would have increased prices in Orkney. It still will. We're still benefiting from a common approach across the north of Scotland hydroelectric board area. So it still will, unless, and this is something, it will unless generators in Orkney accept lower prices for the electricity they sell to folks in Orkney. Now this is proposed by the UK government for new onshore wind farms, in that they're suggesting that people within a certain distance of a wind farm can get cheaper electricity, which has to be paid for by the operators of that wind farm. And the question is, will this stifle development in Orkney? If it does, we'll lose other benefits. So the benefits of jobs, the benefits for community payback could potentially be lost if people don't develop wind farms. And that's something that I'd like to bring up and perhaps discuss in the Q&A session at the end if nobody else has any alternative questions. That's my question. So I also started with the title of the talk talking about Shetland HVDC link. What is the benefit for Orkney? So it'll benefit Orkney in two ways. First, it will reduce the cost of supplying electricity to Shetland. And as I've already said, Orkney is part of an area with a common pricing policy. We will benefit from lower distribution prices once SSEN don't have to subsidise the operation of the power station in Lerwick. That's the first saving. But secondly, it will allow additional wind power to be connected to the GB grid, lowering the cost of electricity across the whole of the GB network, as we need to burn less gas to meet our electricity needs. So it's going to benefit Orkney, is my argument, but when will it benefit Orkney? The Shetland HVDC link should be in operation sometime during 2024, and this picture is of the cables already being installed for the high voltage DC link to Caithness in Shetland from July 2021. So they're already there. It looks rather sort of peaty boggy ground here. And you can see, that they've used big boards to run the machine over, so as to avoid damaging this ground here. That's quite typical. And you can also see that they're wrapping the cable. So the cable will be installed in a duct. There'll be a fill of some imported material wrapped around it, and I think you can just about see where it's been dumped in here, but I'm not 100% sure. But this is all wrapped so as to prevent it moving away, prevent the peat getting into that area. Nicked the picture from SSEN's project website. I'm not sure of the proper way to put their copyright on it, but they can come and see me if they want. They know where I live. So there are other European grid developments going on as well. So I've looked at the periphery. There are also additional projects from Great Britain to Denmark, which are almost as long as the one to Norway, and to France. So we'll have stronger links to there, and they're under construction. They'll be in by 2024. But another interesting one that I found when I was looking around was that talked about the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. At the moment they're on a separate AC grid, and there's an existing DC interconnector from Poland across here. They're adding another DC interconnector through the sea to Lithuania, and then this one here is going to be converted from a DC interconnector to an AC one. Basically the DC converter station has AC lines up to it from either side anyway, so there's no DC cables involved at the moment, and that will allow these three Baltic states to be part of the main European grid that covers all this area down here. That will have advantages in that you will need to have less backup generation in this grid, because the 3,000 megawatts of backup that is kept going in the main European grid will be more than enough to cover for any faults in here. So effectively, whatever they use for backup at the moment, I think it's maybe about 900 megawatts of cover for loss of load or loss of generation can be avoided, and that will save running some machines. So why are interconnectors cheaper than local storage? What I've done here is I've got a battery, and I've sized it to cope with the changes in PV. And for March 2020, we needed a battery of 165 gigawatt hours to absorb energy and discharge it. Now, it's a little bit artificial. It's providing a constant output of 1,200 megawatts from the PV that's already installed in the UK. But it shows what a big battery you have, because you've periods where you're discharging and hardly ever putting anything back in because it's been overcast days. And then later in the month, you've got periods where it's nice and sunny and you're charging the battery up, and you get to fairly closely the same figure of 150,000 gigawatt hours, 150,000 megawatt hours of energy stored. Now it's a massive number, and I get mixed up, and I've had to write it down and calculate it and check it. But we've got 28 million homes in the UK. It's 5.9 kilowatt hours per home, which doesn't seem a right lot, but that's just providing 4.42% of GB's energy. And if I'd done the exercise for summer, I wouldn't have needed such a big battery, and if I'd done it in winter, I would have needed a much bigger battery. And if I'd done it over the whole year, I probably would have needed an even bigger battery again. Because if we were relying on solar, you've got to store a huge amount of energy in summer to cover for the winter. So why are interconnectors cheaper than local storage? I've taken two figures for local storage. I think it's about £300 per kilowatt hour now, which is 49.5 billion. That's just to cover that example that I showed you for March 2022. And you would be able to use that for through the summer as well, but it wouldn't be sufficient in the winter. You bring the cost down to £100 per kilowatt hour, which I believe is a long-term target for energy storage. You got 16.5 billion. The long-distance interconnector to Norway or to Denmark costs 1.68 billion for an interconnector, and that's with an interconnector capacity of 1.4 gigawatts. To cope with the installed PV that's in the UK at the moment, and this is just what we've already got, and we don't use anything else, which is not in reality what happens, because we have gas power stations and pump storage and so on, but we would need 8 interconnectors to cope with that alone, and that would cost 13.2 billion, less than the lowest target price that we're looking for energy storage. Now, I hold my hands up and say I haven't had time to find suitable data sets and make a more accurate estimate. It's very difficult getting data sets in the required timescales across the whole of Europe to do this. When I worked for SSEN, I was able to do it for SSEN with the data available, but I can't do it across the whole of Europe with what I can find very easily. Interconnectors also help us access storage in other areas. Hydroelectric storage reservoirs in Norway is an example I've already mentioned, potentially also in Iceland. So my question was, why is it cheaper than local storage? The answer is we actually need both storage and interconnectors, but we need to ensure that we get the correct balance between them and don't overinvest in storage or interconnectors in relation to the optimum solution. And this will take some serious modelling, and I believe that is the job of National Grid operations that ought to be doing that, and I'm pretty sure they will be. Just whether they publish the results and make it public, I'm not sure. But the thing is there cheap local storage? And there probably is to a certain extent. The cheapest form of storage is a battery we have bought for something else and we can use for storage. EVs are the ideal example. Coupled with smart charging, they can provide a significant energy storage resource. Right, that's as far as I got, I'm afraid. I'll stop sharing. Oh, I've not taken. I thought I'd be about 40 minutes. I've only been 28, so I've rattled through it faster than I thought.
That's right, Martin. So, but thanks for reading that, Martin. There's really interesting stuff in there. So let's chuck it open to the floor. Has anybody got any questions or any points you want to pick up with Martin there? If not, while people are thinking about it, I've got a one. Doug, I saw you come off mute there. Do you want to go in?
Yeah. How is attenuation going to affect the transmission of power, the loss of power in the actual process of transmitting it?
Okay, so if you were to transmit power from Orkney to Norway via Scotland and England, you might lose 10%, and that's about in line with what you'd use putting it in a local battery. So there are losses, that's true, but there are losses in local energy storage as well. The beauty about a transmission line is not how efficient it is. I mean, they're probably broadly similar efficiencies to batteries, but the fact that you don't fill them up. Once you can transmit for an hour, or 5 hours, or 10 hours, or 100 hours. With a battery, you can fill it for an hour, or 2 hours, or 4 hours, and then it's full, and you can't put any more into the battery until you've had time to discharge it at some point in time when discharging it was useful. So it's a solution that can carry on operating for days and days at a time, and that's actually, when I said Norway was providing 3 point some, I forget what the figure was, 3 point some % of our electricity in March, that's because for the vast amount of March it was actually just exporting power from Norway to us on a continuous basis, because with our high gas prices we never really came up with any excess electricity to send back, apart from on 1 or 2 very short occasions, and we have been sending power to Norway, but it was something like 0.2%, or perhaps 0.02, I can't remember now. I didn't put it in the presentation because I thought I'd make it too long if I did. But the thing is, when you looked at what I said to France, almost 3/4 of what we exported went to France, because France had a problem with some nuclear power stations. Their prices rose as it was, and there was opportunity for us to export power to them.
Thanks, Martin. I've got some figures in my head. I'm not sure they're entirely right, but I think there's something like 3% loss per 1,000 kilometres by HVDC, something like that. See, 3% or 1%, I can't remember which one of the two it is, but it's a pretty small percentage of HVDC. And in the event of something like that, I saw a comparison that suggested it's sort of the last few miles where the major losses will happen rather than the major transmission.
That's correct, Neil. But I think what you're talking about is 3% per 1,000 kilometres on the cable, you also lose about 2% on the converter stations at either end. So if you've got a 1,000-kilometre cable, you're probably losing 7%. If you've got a 2,000-kilometre cable, you're only losing 10%.
Thanks for that. I'd got a question as well there, Martin, because you said there was the stuff going up in Shetland and those photographs. Did you say that you thought the cable was coming to Orkney? Because I thought the cable was going round Orkney, it was going straight into
No, I didn't say it came to Orkney. I'm saying it benefited Orkney, but where the cable's running from is just a place a little north of Wick, and it's running out in a loop to the east of Orkney into a bay that is to the west of Lerwick. And then from there it runs up past, if anybody's been to Shetland and knows where Tingwall Airport is, it runs up that valley there to the converter station, which I think is 10 kilometres north of where the cable comes ashore.
And the rough size of that one, Martin, just top of your head?
Well, the capacity of the cable is 600 megawatts. So it's Europe's first 3-terminal DC link. It can transmit 1,200 megawatts from the substation in Keith, 800 megawatts from the substation in Caithness, and 600 megawatts from the substation in Shetland. And all the substations are fully bidirectional. And the cable that goes from Keith to Caithness is rated at 1,200 megawatts. The one that goes from the shore on Caithness to the converter station at Spittal is 800 megawatts. So the converter stations and the cables match. They're basically 3 cable sizes and 3 converter station sizes. And there is this HVDC switching station, which is going to be the first in Europe, just north of Wick.
Thanks, Martin.
And basically, the fact it's 3 terminals is it'll run with all 3 terminals live all the time. If there's a fault, it'll shut down, switch off the faulty section, and get the other section running, I think. But they'll be able to bring it back in very quickly. Whether that is within a few hundred milliseconds, or whether that is several seconds or several tens of seconds, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure that when I worked at SSEN, anybody knew the answer, to be honest. They were still trying to find out then. But that is about 5 years ago now. I'm sure they'll know by now.
If not, they'll find out when they build it.
I think they'll know already.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Okay. Any other questions? Anyone want to jump in on anything? I think it was blindness with information. I saw something change there. Is that somebody came off mute? No? Mark, we're going to come in there?
I don't know. No, it's really interesting. Oh, horrible echo somewhere there. No, it's very interesting, Neil. Very interesting, Martin. And I'm a big fan of interconnectors. And no, just to say, and even I know we've got MSc students every year now, and I'm trying to get one to look at the possibility of distributed wind and the implication of distributed wind. There's a really good paper about 2007 by a guy called Sinden, just looking at how little wind, how little the occurrence is that the whole of the country doesn't have wind. And there's a figure that's something like, that there's for more than 80% of the country to have low wind only happens 10 hours a year. So that interconnectedness, I agree completely. Interconnectedness, answering the question instead of local storage, is great if we can do it. And no, I was just saying but I mean, even this, so that's really good, Martin. I can think up some other projects and proposals based on this for students to look at, because it is just getting good thinking about this and the interconnectors. The worry is political and geopolitical resilience in having these networks, but wherever possible, I'm a big fan, and thank you.
Yeah, I could make a point that the geographical dispersion in the UK is only about a quarter of the potential geographical dispersion across the whole of Europe.
Absolutely.
So we get some benefit from geographical dispersion within the UK, but there is significantly more benefit to be had by interconnecting with Europe. And in fact, I have seen a situation where we were getting, back when Stronsay had 3 small wind turbines, I've seen where Stronsay was getting 100% of output and Burger Hill was only getting 50%. And 2 hours later it had swapped round. Stronsay had dropped to half and Burger Hill had gone to full. And there's not a lot of distance between Stronsay and Burger Hill. And yet the wind speeds were sufficiently different to cause those variations in output power over just
absolutely.
hours.
Yeah. We see that, Martin, across the turbines across the islands. You see it; it's phenomenal, and you wouldn't expect it. But I mean, on average. But no, the other really interesting one along those lines is, I think more recently someone's been looking at, as you say, from a Europe-wide point of view, and mapping out weather fronts and things like that, and weather patterns on an annual basis. And they've done a really nice bit of saying that we don't need to overbuild. We can actually, if we coordinate our build and do it in a sensible way, we can actually get very close to a high level of resilience with no storage. I'm not saying no storage at all, but I think the idea of this, and there's so much more mileage in this, as long as we all can get along and don't start fighting each other, which is the issue, obviously.
I think the thing is we've got to accept that storage is an expensive option, no matter how we do it, whether it's pumped storage or batteries, and up until a certain point, interconnectors will provide a cheaper option for a lot of our getting rid of our excess energy and bringing in energy from elsewhere when we're short.
With the caveat, I would like to say heat storage near user rather than electricity.
Yes, I didn't get into that, but you're absolutely right.
As a cheap way of doing it, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But the question I've got to ask is: has anybody yet developed a heat storage system that lasts for more than about 50 hours?
Yeah, I would say no. Yeah, I mean the sort of losses we're talking about, and the losses we can afford to have in a heat system. I think we're not doing months. And as you say, Matt, you illustrated really well with the solar curve and this imbalance in the UK. When we're dealing with seasonal variation, it's really you obviously can't use heat, but I mean for days and weeks, I think the opportunity is already here. I would say,
yeah.
Keith, you've come off mute. Did you want to chip in?
Yeah, just relating this discussion to the present world situation. Interconnectors are fine until you talk about security. Nobody knows what the future is going to hold. And if we're a hostage to interconnectors for our energy, then you could say that government hasn't done its job properly. Any comments?
I don't have a comment, but just to say that the question or the situation that Keith has proposed was something that was on my mind during the conversation, and I wasn't sure how to bring it in, but I was wondering about, you're speaking about Russia's mostly oil, but the war between Russia and Ukraine, how does that affect things? And then Keith's point about we could be hostage to fortune, with different powers having control over these interconnectors. So any comments on that?
Who wants to go first, Martin?
Well, I'll make a comment. We produce more renewable energy that is produced in this country than we produce fossil fuels, I would think, at the moment. So we import a lot of gas. Now, we import our gas mostly from a very, very secure and friendly country, which is Norway. It's not far away. We're very friendly with it, especially here in Orkney. It's not far off Norwegian Independence Day, and there'll be folks in Broad Street. We're really close, is what I'm saying. But we rely on them. If somebody in Norway decided to stop supplying us with gas, we would be in the same situation as Germany is, with Russia threatening to stop them supplying gas. Germany took a risk with Russia. We're taking a risk with Norway. Our risk is probably better, but it's not impossible. You know, so you can always build something that's absolutely proof against somebody else. You know, we could open our own coal mines, and we could build our own coal-fired power stations, and we could be absolutely sure we'd be okay. But that doesn't take account of the biggest risk that the whole world is facing, which is climate change. And we've got to move quickly to a system that's good for climate change. And deciding to just say we want absolute security, and we'll do it by having millions of batteries. I don't know what the number would be, but, you know, a huge amount of batteries. That's going to push up the resource price for making batteries, and batteries are going to become more expensive. So we don't want to buy any more batteries than we really need, because other people will want them as well. Is that a comment making sense to folks?
So, I'm going to chip in on that. So
yeah, go on.
Yeah, don't forget we are the Renewable Energy Forum, so the idea is to discuss. So this is all right. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, energy independence makes sense, but I think all of the laws of economics, I'm sure Sandy, if he's still on, will be disappeared, I think, but have chipped in on the advantage of trade over insularity. You know, you're allowed different people to specialise in different activities, which then allows you to drive the cost down. And so I think we have to expect that we will trade internationally where we have to, but there is absolutely. Oh, that's Sandy. Sorry, I didn't recognise your Zoom handle. So I'm still about economics, mate. So this is your space, not mine. God Almighty, I did it A level when the world was black and white. But the point is that I think trying to be insular or trying to be self-sufficient will be counterproductive in terms of overall cost. However, a diversity of supply then does give you the opportunity to not be beholden to one particular political regime, shall we say. Sandy, do you want to correct me or jump in?
No, it's just bang on. I dare say we can have energy independence, but it would come at a massive cost. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it was a fascinating presentation, and I think on that, you know, looking outside Europe, I think that was really interesting as well, and the role that North Africa might have in supplying Europe with energy introduces a different sort of political sort of dynamic there as well. And I've certainly seen plans for a grid interconnector across, well, actually a loop around the Mediterranean, but really to sort of hook into the potential solar in North Africa. So yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah. Susan, I see you come off mute. I'm going to jump in.
Okay. I'll let Susan jump in first then. So.
Yeah, I'm going to wait for the echo to stop. Is it all right? Oh, I'm the only one without an echo. That's nice. Okay, I'm doing a project at the moment, a UKRI research project on demand flexibility. And so it's sort of like the reflex a bit. And there isn't a lot known about demand flexibility and how to achieve it. But when I think about the marginal benefit of laying a cable or putting in storage or adding another wind turbine, and I think about the utilization of those assets over time, and I think about why we just did that, and I wonder what the value of flexibility would be in, for example, taking 80 hours a year of worst case scenario out of the system. You know what I mean? Demand flexibility.
Well, can I butt in and say it depends what you mean by demand flexibility. If you're talking about things like deferring a washing machine switching on, that's good. But the most inflexible demand that I've ever seen working in the electricity supply industry is actually those first 20 minutes after you restore the power, when there has been a power cut that's lasted 10 hours. Because
and that might not be.
And there isn't a way to demand, to keep that down.
Right. Well, if you want to have a chat, I do have to say that I was sort of brought into this group, and the rest of the group, it's got Glasgow University and Edinburgh University, and it is an area of research that really hasn't had that much done on it. And so what we mean by demand flexibility, we would like to know I would like to know what would be useful demand flexibility, because I have done demand flexibility research in other places where it was clear what we needed to do. For example, what you just said, after an outage, well, it's possible to work on that and to have a restoration plan that people are aware of, and if it's a thing that happens. So we really need the input from the grid operator about what would be extremely valuable flexibility. I mean, we already know about load shedding in industrial customers, that can be very useful and worth some money. So yeah, our project is actually about residential and small commercial. So that one.
Well, it's not for want of lack of trying by the DNOs. When smart meters were first thought about, one of the first things that DNO said is we went to build a system in that allows us to manage demand through the smart meter. So, for example,
that seems short-sighted.
so for example, back in 2010, we suggested having a smart meter with 2 or 3 circuits on it, and when supply was restored, you only got your top priority circuits restored, which would be your lighting, and then you got your lower priority circuits, which might have been your cooker and your sockets, and then finally you would get your bottom priority circuits, which would be your heating circuits. And that was suggested, and the electricity supply businesses that were thinking they were going to pay for smart meters didn't want to do it, and it got knocked on the head. So I always think we have an SMA meter, not a smart meter. The RT bit got knocked off the head, but that's only a joke if you know that SMA is a formula milk powder for bears.
Oh, I didn't know that. All right, thanks.
You're muted, Neil, don't worry. I will stick my hand up just to respond quickly, Susan. The Ofgem and the Energy Network Association have done quite a lot of good stuff on flexible demand. They recognise something like 12 billion a year savings for the network operators back in about 2010. There's been a lot of work trying to drive that through, rather than overbuilding and rather than classical reinforcement, looking at how we can use flexible demand to save money in operation. So there's quite a lot of stuff there. It's more on the it's technical publications more than research publications, but there's been quite a lot over the last decade or so on that, which is good. And to be honest, as we've started to talk about the work in Orkney, where we've been trying to look at use flexible demand to match in a different way, matching generation and curtailment patterns, is kind of an interesting stuff that it'd be good to share and talk about. But I was really, before I was coming back on the original question from Keith, and I think I wouldn't hammer interconnectors. I think interconnection, Sandy made a really valid point about the values of interconnection, whether that's supply chains or actual cables. But I think the same as any market, one of the best ways we can't get away from the emergency situation where the war chest and the war zone and the absolute things we need. But the best way to protect yourself is to have many connections, whether that's trading or in infrastructure, and that diversity gives us the best option.
And I would also add on to that the minimising demand. So, if you don't need to import it from anywhere, then the whole energy efficiency thing, getting that back up the stacks is critically important. And it's maddening that it keeps getting such a low priority. Okay, Keith, you're not on mute at the moment. Did you want to come in on something there, or was that just left over?
Sorry.
That's right.
It's just a further comment on the security issue. I mean, it is the first tenet of government is to keep people safe. And any politician who loses sight of that, whether it's keeping the lights burning or whatever, really is doing a disservice. And I often wish politicians would take a course in history, and they'll see how fickle the world situation is, even in my lifetime. And I don't think you should just dismiss that issue and say, oh yeah, plenty of interconnectors will be okay. I think that's a fool attitude.
No, so if it responds to me, Keith, I wasn't dismissing it from that point of view. I say within that, how we deal with what the stuff we can't supply reasonably and feasibly, economically. The best way to protect ourselves is have many connections, whether that's trading or electric connections. I'm not dismissing our own resilience, definitely not.
Okay. Any other questions for Martin? If not, I've got a little anecdote you might be interested in. I'm going to tell it to you lot because you're sad enough and a bit energy anarchy that it might mean something to you. Have I told you about the story about Cecil Parkinson being up in Orkney? So apparently Cecil Parkinson came and inaugurated the Burger Hill LS2 turbine. So as you remember, that was the 3 megawatt, I seem to remember. That was the LS1. LS1, thanks, Martin. So so anyway, he came up, and I think it was November 78, I think it was. And there's two parts to this. One is that I found that there's a little piece in Hansard, which is a discussion that then took place, which basically is, so, well, my right honourable friend, tell me what he was doing last week. Oh, yes, I was up in Orkney inaugurating the LS1, and it's a turbine, and so the rotor blade is 60 metres in diameter, about the size of St Paul's Cathedral, all that sort of stuff, and how much he's spending. Well, about £3 million a year on the project, and this, that, and the other. But I've looked at it, and I really don't see that there's any future for wind energy to supply a significant amount of the UK's power, says Cecil Parkinson. And that was 2 weeks after he'd come up to Orkney to see the machine. I so love to find out who got to him in those 2 weeks between him coming up here and seeing it and then taking that opinion. It's also interesting to see that he was then questioned by Mr. Wallace, who was in the House at the time. That was Aussie Jim. And the other bit is in Cecil Parkinson's autobiography, which I sadly read some of, it talks about him coming up to Orkney. And at the time, they were looking at how they were going to privatise the electricity industry, and particularly how they could flog off the nuclear power stations, which was in the list of, I'm not sure anybody really wants one sort of problem. And apparently, and it says in his autobiography that he got the entire idea of the non-fossil fuel obligation from a conversation he had for an American from California who was up at the inauguration of the LS1, because that's what they were doing in California, to have a mandate for people to supply renewable energy. He thought, what a great idea. And that created the non-fossil fuel obligation, which was principally designed to support the privatisation of the nuclear industry. And he found that idea out in Orkney. Who knew? There you go.
Well, I could also tell you a story about Cecil Parkinson and the opening of the LS1. I got called out that morning at about 6 o'clock for a fault in Bursey. Spent up until about 1 o'clock finding and fixing it. Shot down to Stromness to pick up my auntie on the boat from the old St. Ola. And then, because I was starving, I said, I'm sure there's a lunch being put on for the opening of the LS1. Let's go to Burger Hill and see if we can grab some lunch there. So I shot up, dived out of the car, head down, and nearly headbutted a guy coming out of the visitor centre. When I had a look, the guy had stopped me. It was Cecil Parkinson.
So you nearly nutted Cecil Parkinson, that's what you tell us.
Just about headbutted him, I had my head down, yeah.
Brilliant.
But anyway, there is one question that I hoped that would raise a wee bit of controversy and a bit of discussion that I put in my presentation, and that was the question of cheaper electricity provided by the operators of wind farms to locals, and you know, that is a significant thing that the government are proposing for onshore wind farms. Now, will that potentially mean that there is less profit to be made from onshore wind farms? Will that then delay the introduction of onshore wind farms? I think it's almost another way of slowing them down.
Could I ask a question there? In terms of and Mark will probably know the best numbers here, but in terms of the value to a wind farm operator, you're getting paid, or the turbines are getting paid, what, 4 or 5 pence a kilowatt hour? I don't know what the prices are now, because you're getting a spot price on electricity sales. And how does that compare with what we're paying for electricity we buy from the network?
Up until second half of last year, we were getting between 4 and 6 pence a unit in consumer terms, and you were getting 13, wasn't it 13, 14 just before the price went through the roof. However, when the price went through the roof, so you'd almost, and people would say, oh, that's terrible, it's like a third of the price. The export price and turbines in Orkney fixed in October last year at 130, so 13p a unit, which is translating to 20, 27 is going to be the next sort of thing. So it's getting closer. It's still that sort of 12 pence above, Neil, I would say. If that gives you an idea. But it's more balanced now, because if that makes sense.
So the cost of handling the electricity is 12-ish p. In the background, that's the sort of the merchant activity.
It looks like it. Or £5 billion profit to BP in 3 months. That's probably
the prices charged by the DNOs are published on their websites, and I think I worked out for a hydroelectric area, the old North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board area, it's about 7 pence, and people talk about a 2 pence per kilowatt hour premium in Scotland. That would lead me to think that elsewhere it's about 5 pence.
Yeah, I think the point that I was trying to assemble in my head was if we could get the ability for people to be able to supply energy locally but not need to use a private wire, then the costs would come closer to the cost of production. And it's really a case of what would it cost to run a network that you basically move energy around the islands versus the costs that we've got a socialised cost in and around the whole north of Scotland. So that's a point I was just trying to get straight in my head, that I entirely get the fact that we have benefited from a lower cost than would be the case if we'd been charged as a separate local entity in the past, but I'm not quite sure whether that's still the case now there's so much local generation. I just don't know the answer to that. Mark, you come in?
It's a funny one, and I don't want to be seen as a network apologist on this, but when talking about, it was the Open Networks advisory group a few years ago, and there's one of the guys, Martin will probably know him, and I'm so bad with names, I can't remember his names. He's been in pricing for many decades and been involved, and he was sort of saying, yeah, when we started out, we actually did decide that we were going to charge per kilowatt hour. We actually there's many ways, there was lots of other alternatives there. We were going to charge a flat rate per day, a flat rate per year to people, because most of the time, 99.something% of the time, it doesn't matter about the electricity. The cost is when one person wants it and another person hasn't got it. So actually, it doesn't actually matter how much we produce most of the time. It's what we're paying for is we're paying for it that time when you want it and not someone, and it's limited. And there's an eye-opening way of looking things as well. It's not about how much we could just produce. Not like flexibility, but no, it was just that one. It was that one principle. It was an eye opener to me when he said it, because Yeah, most of the time we have the convenience of charging per kilowatt hour and everything's structured around that. And we'll say, well, Orkney produces loads of kilowatt hours, but Orkney still, as you know, Neil, so what was it, 17, what do we work out, 17, 18% import when we really, really need it because we haven't got it. How do we pay for that resilience? How do we pay for, well, Keith's dropped off the line, when we need it and someone else doesn't want to give it to us? And that's the cost of the system that we run.
Well, on a technical basis, if the interconnector's not there, Kirkwall Power Station takes up the slack, and we're then burning oil in old diesel engines. And I mean, they are old diesel engines. I think the newest one that's operational is put in 1977. So it's the newest one's 45 years old. The oldest one went in 69. So it's over 53 years old. They're antiques, really. They ought to be in a museum. We should take this thing up and say, we should add to the sign, Kirkwall Power Station Museum.
I'll get a grant, you know, they can subsidise it somewhere. Make an arts installation, we're laughing.
Yeah.
But no, yeah, and to say, I don't want to be dismissive. I mean, the Heat from Orkney project, we literally did that. So we gave people a rebate for them allowing us to put electricity into their heaters on the principle that we could put it in when we wanted to, and they still used it when they wanted to. And that was the beauty of flexibility. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of flexibility. Don't get me wrong from that point of view. But just that point, Neil, I worry that we go, oh, we produce a lot, we should get it cheaper. And we're not paying for those kilowatt hours. We're paying for when we need it and someone hasn't got it, or when they've got to ship in generators because we've had storm, whatever comes through and knocks all the system out. It's the resilience we're paying for.
It feels to me as though there is a further element there, which is that we are basically prevented from supplying power very locally, because once we've paid for the costs of wires and stuff, the marginal cost of production of some of these wind turbines is pretty close to zero. And to leaving the machines idle when there is need, we know the iniquity of that, but how does one get around it? I mean, it could be other things, like there's a universal allowance of a certain amount of energy, and then, you know, the different cost models. But as you say, there are lots of different ways to skin that particular cat. So other animals are available.
Well, if the costs of running a distribution network were apportioned in a fairer way, what would happen is that the standing charge would shoot up, and the charge per kilowatt hour would drop, and the charge per kilowatt hour would vary every half hour to reflect the losses in the system for that half hour period. And so we might be looking at an average loss in the distribution system to Orkney of 10%, but at tea time that might be 14%, and at 3 o'clock in the morning it might be 5%, and therefore the price per kilowatt would have to change over that sort of range of prices to pay for the losses. And basically losses are the only thing that really ought to be priced in pence per kilowatt, because everything else is an asset which you've got to put in and build and maintain and repair, whether you use any electricity off the end of it or not.
Good. Okay. Well, look, I think
anyway, there's one more question that I asked in my thing, and really we still haven't come to it. Is do we think that it's the right thing that it's been proposed by the UK government that wind farms provide cheap electricity, which means selling some of their electricity for less than the market rate to local people? They would still have to pay the same distribution costs as they do now, that under the government's proposal, as far as I can see. But what they're basically saying is that how would it work? How would you, if you're building a wind farm in, let's build a new wind farm that doesn't exist at the moment in, say, where we've got one at the moment, on Glimsholm, say we build a wind farm on Glimsholm. and we want to then give people in Finstown a reduced rate. How would that work? We'd have to meter it, we'd have to have smart meters, we'd have to say, we'll sell it you for 2p whenever we're producing enough to power you, and you'll pay a normal price when we can't supply it, or, you know, there's different models. Has anybody thought that through?
I mean, it's really interesting, and in some ways a strange idea, but it's a bit like community benefit payments. And you know, there's all sorts of arguments over. They said that's simpler because what you say is true. The meter and so on just makes it really complicated. But it's the same sort of principle, and it's you know, it's compensation for something, but nobody's quite explicit about what it's for. There's just this kind of sense that people believe that they have a kind of claim on that energy, or because something's on the skyline in their backyard. But it's interesting, there's lots of cows walking about the fields round about us, but we don't expect to get a fillet steak cheaper. So I'm not saying one's right or wrong, but it's really interesting that there's this expectation around this with energy, and the government's kind of siding with that now. With this proposal, complicated as it is, but we don't expect it from other things.
I'd be interested to know how much the distribution costs of this marginal extra piece of energy would be. Because it doesn't feel as though that's linear, because once you've paid for the capital cost, then would all the handling costs of the electricity be as great? Because by definition, you're seeking to supply the electricity somewhat locally. You are by definition not seeking to transmit that. So I would argue that some of the system costs should be less for that electricity, rather than it necessarily being sold at lower price per unit. I would argue it's actually there's less back office work involved.
I obviously am the TI department for grid operators, Neil, because that's what they've done over the last couple of decades, I suppose. When we had negative duos charges and things like that, basically, so use of system charges to connect to 11 kV and 33 kV, they paid us instead of us paying them, and that was to incentivize us just to supply that locally to avoid the distribution and the transmission costs. I don't know. It's a really weird one. I mean, I'd love the idea. I'd love to in some way, but it's equally Ecotricity. It was Ecotricity. They did try it because they had the advantage that they both owned generation and a retail supply at the time. They gave it cheaper on free near their turbines. It just feels a bit like bribery. I mean, to be honest, I mean, development trusts, every time a community puts up a wind turbine, someone comes to that public meeting and says, when you say, what do you want with this? Free electricity. And our standard line is, well, the best and most valuable electricity is the one you don't use. Here's some insulation and some energy efficiency measures, because just to give people free electricity doesn't seem to help much and reduce it. You know, it's not owning up to the wider responsibility, even from a social point of view or an infrastructure point of view. I'm not there really. So.
Anybody else want to chip in? If not, 8:10.
I'm just really curious about this idea of the free electricity, and I'm sort of thinking it over in my mind. And what if you were to pay for the power of your connection rather than the kilowatt hours you used? Supposing you said that you had your connection to your house was maybe a silly figure, maybe 10 kilowatts or something like that, 1 kilowatt, let's say, and it was up to you. You could get 1 kilowatt at any time you liked, but if you wanted to use more than that, you had to store it. So it would be up to you to provide the means of leveling it out.
It's an interesting idea. I think that's the way water was supplied. You paid by the pipe size at one point.
There actually still is one electricity company in New Zealand use that system, and basically the price is $50 for a 10 amp fuse, and then $75 for a 15 amp fuse per month, and it goes up. And this electricity company is on a very remote part of the west coast of the South Island. They only have about 150 customers, and they have about 35 different published tariffs depending on your size of fuse and whether it's single phase or 3 phase. and they don't have any staff. They just borrow some staff from another electricity company who have to drive 50 or 60 miles to get there if they get a fault on the lines and so on. But that's a method that does work if that's what you want to do, and that puts all the cost on the capacity that's available and none on the energy. And we're putting far more on the energy relative to the capacity. We don't pay anywhere near enough for the capacity that we have available in our homes in the standing charges to reflect the actual cost of providing that. And that's something that's been driven over many years by customer campaigns. You know, people have been campaigning for not having standing charges. There'll still be people campaigning for no standing charges on a regular basis now. But that is not cost reflective of actually providing that service. And it's something that you've got to decide what you want to do.
Andy and then Mark.
Sandy, yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's interesting thinking about people that are in fuel poverty, and the standing charge, you know, a larger standing charge might and a lower per kilowatt tariff might work better because it's a lot of people that are stuck at home all the time and have got the heating on all the time that are in real trouble. It'd be interesting to see how that changed things. I think removing a kilowatt charge altogether, and if you just paid for your capacity, then there's no incentive to moderate your behaviour at all. And the thing is that, you know, energy is going to be scarce. You know, we're going to need it for everything. So I would be very, very wary about, like Mark, about just saying, well, you know, it's you pay for a pipe or a cable and just use as much as you want. Just have the heating on all the time and the windows open.
Yeah, that was a perfect segue. Yeah, it's a perfect segue, Sandy. Because yeah, Martin, the other instance where that happens is not just in New Zealand, even in Scotland, where we have non-licensed supply, where we have off-grid community grids, and where the community is having to administer that as well, Mike. And as Sandy is basically saying, if you have a very expensive overhead to collect all those kilowatt hours and record it, and it's cheaper just to do a flat rate. So I won't name this particular community on the West Coast, but they had a real issue though, because they had that was based on connection capacity, but one particular building was just, you ended up using nearly 10% of the whole grid supply, and they were doing something quite illegal in their roof space and in dark corners. But this has honestly happened. This is not apocryphal. They were actually using huge amount of electricity, both to keep themselves and a fairly vigorous botanical area growing. So this is one of the issues that you potentially face with this. But yeah, it's with people gaming the system. But people game the system wherever. It just happens.
Is that a vertical farm?
It was an elevated farm, is all I would say, and it was quite high up, I would say.
Very high on occasion.
At least everybody was happy.
Okay. And on that bombshell. Okay, any more for any more? If not, I'm going to say, Martin, look, thanks very much indeed for the preparation of that and thinking that through. That was very stimulating. That was a very good, that's started a good conversation this evening. So thank you very much indeed for doing that. On other level, the next meeting is going to be the annual general meeting, which date I can't remember. Does anybody happen to remember what it is, Mark or anyway? So somebody will remember the date. So watch this space, but please do come along to the AGM. And also, if you would like to come onto the OREF board, there are a couple of people standing down this year. So if you would like to come on, we'd be delighted to have some people on the board. So, into the commercial. Just to say thanks again, Martin. Thanks everybody for coming along tonight. Thanks to Mark Kay for the Zoom side of things, and see you all on a small screen somewhere. And actually, the AGM is in person as well. Okay. Good night, all.